The whole name would be Marjorie Osbourne, Grathwol, driver. And that would say something about my origin. My mother and father's people are from eastern Long Island, across the Sound from Connecticut, near Montauk Point on the South Fork, and near Orient Point on the North Fork. My mother always told me that when I talked about the original ancestors, if it were the Tuttles or if it were the Smiths or that yes, they were among the early settlers in New England. Not to claim the Mayflower, but maybe the second or the third ship, so early on. But in due time, of course, people leave or people intermarry and so forth. And there was a time in the 1800s when there were disturbances in Europe, and many of those early Germans that came to our country came at that time. And some of the Polish people came about that time. Eastern Long Island was a nice place for them to go because it's agricultural area. So the Grathwol part of my name is German, and that was my father's grandfather. His mother is also among those early settlers of Eastern Long Island. So as far as history is concerned, that's very much a part of people in that part of our country. And something that's almost like it is right here in Guam, because when you meet somebody, you meet not just this one person, but you hear about who they're related to. And that puts you in a certain setting. So I was very much at home when I came here, except I didn't bring my relatives with me, but the atmosphere was all here at the time. So part of my early schooling, a few years were in Puerto Rico and a few years were in the States. And from there, I went on to college at Middlebury in Vermont and specialized in their language school, Spanish school. Graduated there and then began teaching in New York State with a major in Spanish. I taught Spanish and I taught social sciences, actually, specializing in the history of Latin America. And then the time came when my husband was invited by RCA Communications to come and help set up the commercial station here and from Okinawa. He came here to Guam because they were developing the RCA Communications station here. About as soon as I arrived anyway, if you could do anything in 1953, so close to the end of the war here, didn't matter what you could do, there was a job for you. And so the first thing that I was asked to do was to teach at George Washington High School, which was the 16 Quonset huts, the elephant Quonset huts, along what is now Route 8. And that was a wonderful adventure. I shall never regret having taught there. At that time, we still had large numbers of the students from the Trust Territory. We had a number of them from Palau. And some of those young people became the leaders of their respective areas, including here in Guam. It truly was a very wonderful experience. And I taught there 2 years, and at that time they began to build what was called the Tumon School, and that became Kennedy School with the assassination of the president. And so there were 2 of us that were transferred from the George Washington Quonsets to the Tumon School. And that was Betty Guerrero. Many people will remember Betty Guerrero, myself. And that too was a very interesting experience. And I still see some of those students around, and it's always nice to see them. Then I had been asked to Oh, I guess to teach some introductory Spanish at the university. At the time, Dr. Yamashita was the president, the first president. And in due time, I was hired to do something that was in the mind of Dr. Yamashita and especially Alex Flores. And that was the need to create a research library here in this part of Micronesia. Because right after the war, there was a lot of research that was done by anthropologists primarily in what became the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands. And that included the Marianas, the Northern Marianas. There was a lot of work that was done in Saipan, a lot of work was done in Tinian, and a lot of work that was done here in Guam. And I think that both of these gentlemen realized that there were a number of Chamorro families who had been interviewed by these various anthropologists, but nobody ever had heard what were the results. What had they found out? What was, So we want to know too. So we need a library here. At the time that I was hired, Paul Carano was already there and already teaching Guam history. Emily Johnston had her family and had a little extra time and was studying all of the flora and fauna of Guam as a student. And she was so very knowledgeable, having been close to Mrs. Agueda Johnston, knew a great deal about what had happened on this island, as it was easily discussed in the family all of the time. And she was a key person for this project. Well, this project, eventually we sat down and came up with a name for it. And that's where we came up with the name Micronesian Area Research Center. And from there, we went about trying to create such a library. In 1966, I believe it was, or 67, maybe 68, typhoon in Saipan destroyed their school, the Mount Carmel School. The sisters who had been running that school came over here to Guam to live in the home that Mr. Artero had given the Mercedarian sisters. And among those sisters was the principal of the school, who was Sister Felicia Plaza. And added to that also our Jesuit colleagues here at the university. Father James McDonough was a research associate of ours who did research on materials available in Germany that we have eventually had copies made and brought back here. Also about that time, Father Tom McGrath, he became a very important part of our early group at MARC. That gave us a little nucleus of 4 or 5 people to try to develop this beginning library.